In this section, I will rapidly run through some of the highlights, some of the great discoveries of the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition under director George Reisner. Here's the overview plan again of Giza, and in red type you can see all of the different excavation zones and how Reisner progressed from one area to another. Circled in green there is the far western cemetery, and it's here that Reisner discovered an interesting set of tombstones. These are known today as slab stelae. They're rectangular inscribed stelae of the tomb owner, and the interesting thing is they represent the only decoration in the tomb whatsoever. So under Khufu, these original mastaba superstructures did not have decorated chapels, with a few exceptions. They only had a slab stela set into an emplacement, a kind of an empty frame, on the outside, at the southern end of the east face of the mastaba. This is one of the most famous ones, the beautifully preserved stela of a man named Wepem Nefret. It's in Berkeley today in the Hearst Museum, because this comes from the Hearst years at Giza, not the Harvard MFA years at Giza. There are about 15 surviving slab stelae and emplacements that were empty for many, many more. About 3 of them have beautiful painted decoration, but they are spectacular. They show the tomb owner seated in front of a table of offering loaves of bread. They have names and titles, lists of offerings, and at the right, that sort of crossword puzzle area, is actually a list of different types of linen needed for a successful burial. They show a very low relief carving style typical of the reign of Khufu. So slab stelae were one of the major artifacts found during the Khufu era mastabas. Another one you see here on the screen. These are called reserve heads. And in another section I talk in more detail about the reserve head of Nefer. Here you see this glorious photograph taken at Harvard camp around 1913 of many of the reserve heads in the Harvard camp office. It almost looks like invaders from Mars, doesn't it? These are spectacular pieces, mostly anonymous, because remember they come from mastabas that usually don't have any other inscriptions. And they seem to break the Egyptian rules of funerary equipment because they attempt to show individual features, individual portraiture or likenesses. That's not typical for Egyptian art. They're found in disturbed contexts at the bottom of burial shafts, so we're still not exactly sure about their original purpose. But we call them reserve heads, perhaps in reserve in case the mummy is damaged, and these could act as a sort of substitute home for the spirit. So when you think of the original mastaba fields as built by George Reisner, think of slab stelae and reserve heads. It's only later that the mastabas get additional chapels and chambers and inscriptions and decorated walls. That happens later in the 4th dynasty, and certainly onward in the 5th and 6th. In fact, some of our best biographical or historical texts or legal texts come from the later dynasties of the Old Kingdom. Next, in 1906 or 7, Reisner moved all the way to the smallest pyramid complex of Menkaure. That's circled now in green on the plan. And he started at the Pyramid Temple, abutting the east face of the pyramid. Very cleverly, he sent his photographer a third of the way up the pyramid and said, I want you to shoot a photograph every night of our progress. And in this way, we got a sort of rapid-fire time-lapse photography scene of the clearance of this temple. We can show that to you in another section. Here, too, were found in at least 3 different places fragments of a colossal statue of King Menkaure in alabaster or calcite. Here you see in one corridor the knees and the legs. There is the head, and back in Boston it went through various permutations of restoration and eventually was completely restored, where it is one of the joys of the Egyptian galleries today. The excavations continued, and the next location was moving further east to the Menkaure Valley Temple. This was probably stratigraphically the most complex excavation Reisner did at Giza, because you not only had the king's mortuary temple, but it was unfinished. Begun in stone, finished by his successor Shepseskaf in mud brick, went through multiple building phases, and then later in the Old Kingdom it was actually inhabited, became a kind of a sacred slum, as one of my colleagues calls it, priests' houses in the courtyard, ovens, storage bins, all kinds of things. So you've got settlement archaeology, you've got mortuary temple archaeology, and along the way, thousands and thousands of artifacts. Not only some of the great statuary that are now in the Cairo Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, but thousands of stone vessels, pottery sherds, fragmentary inscriptions. Here is just one sample, the very famous pear statue or dyad of King Menkaure, and probably a queen, found in 1910. And the photograph in the lower left shows it up at Harvard camp in the courtyard. In addition to that, found a little bit earlier, were a series of triads showing King Menkaure and the goddess Hathor, and then usually a minor deity, deity of a nome or a region of Egypt. There might have been many, many of these. 4 beautifully intact and perfect ones were found. 3 are in the Cairo Museum today, and the one you see in the photograph here with Hathor seated in the middle, that's the one that's in Boston. Reisner was so excited and pleased by these discoveries, and he really felt it cemented his career back home in Boston. He wrote, "I've always counted that excavation at the temples of the Third Pyramid as the most fortunate of my experiences. They led to the establishment of the Harvard-Boston Expedition on a firm basis, to my appointment as a curator of the Egyptian Department of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and to a professorship of Egyptology in Harvard University." Not bad for discovering a few masterpieces. The work continued, and after interludes in Nubia and at other sites, by 1924 the expedition was ready to tackle the Eastern Cemetery at Giza. In 25, Reisner returned to Harvard to teach, so he set the men working near the 3 Queens pyramids, and there in 1925 turned up one of the most exciting discoveries ever. The photographic tripod of the photographer's work slipped into the limestone and revealed a kind of a plaster covering, hiding something underneath. It was a burial shaft with a connecting staircase, and it went down and down and down, almost 100 feet underground, until it revealed a tiny, unfinished burial chamber filled with deteriorated objects of furniture, vessels, a beautiful alabaster sarcophagus, strange poles lying on top of it. Here you see the photograph in original state, and then down below a painting done by Joseph Lyndon Smith, Reisner's friend. So the next 2 years, 1925 to 1927, were spent lying on mattresses, removing with tweezers every little tiny bit to try to get from one layer to the next, taking thousands of pages of notes, thousands of photographs, and eventually restoring this material. It turned out to be the burial place of Queen Hetepheres, the mother of Khufu, and among all the objects were spectacular examples of Old Kingdom furniture: a carrying chair, a bed with canopy, 2 sitting chairs, a curtain box, many other items as well. We've modeled this in 3D, and you'll be able to visit or take a virtual tour of this tomb and see how it looked back in the 4th Dynasty. Of course, what Reisner and his team saw were a mass of deteriorated materials. No wood had survived. There were floods, there were insects. It was a mess. But many conservators worked on this project, among them Ahmed Youssef, who was employed at the Cairo Museum, and he worked on the curtain box and a lot of the furniture. Later in 1954, after the discovery of Khufu's boat on the south side of the pyramid, he was the one who put that together as well. And so here are some comparison photographs of the restored furniture. Above, the versions in the Cairo Museum with modern wood, and down below, complete reconstruction in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And another exciting discovery was one of the best preserved female mummies ever found at Giza. This comes from a large mastaba tomb west of the Great Pyramid, numbered G2220. Inside, a huge cedar coffin pictured here. You can see the mummy still wrapped in fine linen in imitation of an actual linen dress, and the coffin itself is gigantic. It dwarfs the body. Wonderful cedar planks that doubtless came from Lebanon. And of course, there were beautiful wall scenes and inscriptions, legal texts, historical texts, biographical texts, scenes showing every aspect of life in ancient Egypt: craftsmanship, furniture construction, work in the fields, livestock, ceremonies. Everything was there. These are the primary sources for almost any aspect of Egyptian civilization that you could want to study. And in the burial chambers, coffins and sarcophagi. You see a big pile of them here, waiting to be crated up and shipped either to the Cairo Museum or to the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And the one with the red arrow actually shows you a much later example. This one dates to Dynasty 26, so about 600 BC or so, much later than the rectangular Old Kingdom versions you see in the photo to the left. This one belongs to the overseer of the army, or the general Khepere, and it came home to Boston as well. So there are thousands of objects in these museums now, both on display and in storage, all of them waiting more meticulous attention and study and publication, whether it's in books, whether it's online, in research websites. All of this material needs thorough investigation, and we have a lot more to learn about the Gizeh necropolis.